Francisco, this leaves oneself a little bit speechless because I think it's much more complicated than usually people think when they talk about inequality. It's much more sensitive, it's much more detailed, and we have to look at it from different point of views. It's for sure much more difficult than usually we read in the media. No? So it's really good that we look into the subject of inequality. Let's start at the end of your talk, where you spoke about growth and inequality and the relation, and how much damaging, besides social aspects, inequality is really for economy and for future prosperous times. Do you want to comment of it, or do you want to talk a little bit more about it?
Well, let me say a couple of things, and then be interested to hear from Jens, and then later, of course, to hear from you all. But so first, on inequality and growth, I'll say a couple of things. Economists have been interested in that question for a long time, and there's lots of empirical work trying to look at the effect of past inequality on future growth. And most of that is inconclusive. As one colleague of mine used to say at the World Bank, you can find, if you're interested in inequality and growth and you want a result, you can find a paper that will give you that result, whatever the result is. Some say inequality is bad for growth, some say inequality is good for growth. One paper I like a lot by two Spanish economists, Marrero and Rodriguez, said, well, maybe it's because, well, the original, I used to say that inequality is like cholesterol. There are good types and bad types, and inequality of opportunity is the bad type. So these guys said, well, maybe it's that. And so they decomposed for the US the effect of inequality of opportunity between types and the others. And then they found a much more significant effect. And indeed, as expected, it was the inequality of opportunity, the inequality due to things you can't control, that reduced growth in US states. Okay? And there's other evidence, there's microeconomic evidence on how, for example, giving women the right to work or certain legislative changes that would enable women to access some professions which they weren't able to before, increased performance and productivity in those. So it's this idea that if you waste talent because you have groups of people that don't have access to the opportunities to be productive, you're likely to do less well. I think, there's still debate, but I think the evidence on that is now much more conclusive. In a little while, I don't want to speak too long because I've already spoken too much and I want to hear Jens, but in a little while I'll come back to this thing that you said about the media, because I want to comment on that as well, but maybe...
I'm actually surprised you say that this evidence is not firmly established, because my reading of the studies from the World Bank was always that there was, at least evidence for extreme forms of inequality have a negative impact on growth. And one argument that was brought forward in these studies is human capital formation, that extreme forms of social inequality lead to lower human capital formation, and that then deprives society of potential growth. Right. Let me, maybe from a very different perspective, talk about this issue of growth, and decidedly from a sociological perspective. And this is the argument I want to make, is that growth has an important impact on the possibility of social integration of societies, and in a way can smooth over social inequalities in terms of social conflict. And the reason for this is that in a growing society, two reasons probably. One is, in a growing society, there is simply more to distribute, which makes distributional conflicts less vibrant. But then also, people in a growing society have the opportunity or have the aspiration, the realistic belief that they can actually be socially upwardly mobile. And this is something we talked about also before when we talked about elements of social closure, which are more coming into the picture over the last 30 years compared to the post-war period, that a society that is not growing is a society that will have more distributional conflicts for these reasons.
No, I agree with that. I mean, maybe too simple, but one way to sort of, agree with you is to say that maybe people tend to compare themselves with two reference points. One is, who is doing very well in society, but the other is themselves yesterday. And so if you're growing, if you're doing better than you were yesterday, or if you expect you're doing better than your parents, as you showed in the chatty graph, or you expect your children to do better than you, okay, so there's this guy Elon Musk going to the sky. Everybody's getting better. Now, if Elon Musk is going to the sky and nobody's getting better at the bottom, which is what's happening in America now, you show the Branko Milanovic's, then people are less willing, perhaps, to forgive that. I think you're quite right.
If this hope that my children have it better than me is getting lost, and I realize that my children will be worse off, what does this mean for a society?
Yeah, I mean, I think it links to, again, Jens is probably better qualified to answer, but I think it leads to the kind of populism that you were talking about earlier. It leads to a sort of hopelessness amongst people that feel forgotten and ignored, and who tend to take drastic attitudes of some kind or another. I mean, the United States comes up a lot in these conversations, and it's not surprising. The US is a great example for this. Let me just mention that voting for Trump is one thing you can do, but the other thing you can do is kill yourself in one way or another. And you may be familiar with Ann Kay's and Angus Deaton's book called Deaths of Despair, where they document that certain groups in the US, particularly actually, first of all, amongst whites without college education, mortality, life expectancy had stopped growing. Again, relates to one of your graphs. But dynamically, mortality, so life expectancy had stopped growing, and when they looked at why, it was a big increase in deaths due to substance abuse, suicide, and alcohol-related illness, which they called deaths of despair. So it's populism, but it's also a number of other terrible things that happen, particularly in a society which is built on the idea of the American dream that you refer to, and this idea that things are meritocratic. Now, if the system is meritocratic, and I'm not doing well, then it's my fault. What can I do? And then I drink,
And it's actually interesting. I don't know whether you're aware of the work by Jonathan Mitchell on social inequality attitudes in a comparative perspective. And he finds that this self-attribution of failure becomes stronger the more meritocratic a society defines itself. So in a way, inequality not only breeds inequality in the next generation, as you say, but it also breeds an attitude of self-attribution of this inequality.
I mean, you said there are these two kinds of inequality. One, the bad one, which is caused because you are born in the wrong country at the wrong time, in the wrong family or whatever. And the other one because of merit. Now, lately we can see that also the inequality caused by merit is causing more trouble, no?
So that's a very good point, and it's one of the critiques of the equality of opportunity is this idea that, well, how do you measure merit? How do you measure effort? Where is it coming from? So one thing I want to say, first of all, is that, let me make two brief points about that. One is that one of the things we give our children is a set of beliefs and a set of norms. And often hard work is something that we encourage in children. And it's often the case that the least privileged, the poorest groups in society fail to inculcate that as much, in part because they've worked very hard and it hasn't helped them. Whereas more dominant groups often do convey that. So if you look at time spent studying, if you look at many measures of hard work, you'll find that children from richer groups have more of that. Now that is not, the average of the group is then a characteristic of the group. It's a circumstance. It's not merit in the way we guarantee that is by comparing people in percentiles of the distribution, but I don't want to get technical. But the philosophical point is that average differences in work ethic between groups is also a circumstance, and so should be compensated for in some way. Now there was another point I was going to make, but I forgot.
You wanted to make a comment on the media, why we get the wrong impression in media.
Yeah, just 2 quick points on that as well. I'll be interested to hear other people's views as well. One is that by focusing on this stuff, so that's the first point. I do not want to diminish the importance of covering what the media has often been covering, which is the kind of work by Thomas Piketty and others that Jens also showed, which is about documenting what's been happening to incomes at the very top. And as we spoke earlier, Corinne, there has been a revolution in inequality studies in moving the data bases that we use from just household surveys to tax data, which allow us to look at the top much better. So I don't want to take away from that at all. I think that's very important. Sometimes people go further, so your graph, the graph that Jens showed, has the sharing national income. That's what's in that picture. Sharing national income is not the sharing fiscal income. There's a whole lot of GDP that doesn't get allocated to individuals because it stays in companies or is invested in infrastructure. That stuff gets allocated by a team of researchers in ways that require some assumptions and which are not as transparent as I would like. So there's some worry there, but I don't want to take away at all from the emphasis on the very top. And one part of the emphasis on the very top is that it allows for political capture. Economic power and political power go together. And when you have too much of an oligarchy, it tends to capture the political making process. Elon Musk's buying of Twitter that happened yesterday and that everyone's talking about is sort of an example of that. So that's one thing I wanted to say. The other one is the following. I think if you ask people in the street, even if you ask those of us here, is inequality mostly rising in the world or mostly falling? We would all say it's mostly rising. And it turns out that's not strictly true. Global inequality, of the kind that Milanovic talks about, has actually been falling for the last 30 years, in large part because of China and India and so on. But even inequality within countries has been falling in many countries. It's just that those countries are not the United States and Britain, where a large chunk of the economists, philosophers, sociologists, politicians, journalists, write from. And in the US and in the UK less so in the last short period, inequality has risen dramatically. So we think inequality is rising everywhere, but in Brazil it's been falling. In most of Latin America it's been falling. In a number of African countries it's been falling. In France it's stayed the same. In Germany since around 2012, 2013, it's also stayed the same. So that's a problem with the media. So 2 messages, right? One is I don't want to take away from the emphasis on that, but I would like the emphasis on that to look at the whole world and not just at the US and Britain. They continue to shape the discourse, and it leads to this false sense that there's nothing we can do. In fact, many countries are reducing inequality.
And I'm very happy you're saying this, because this is exactly my impression as well. I mean, the whole discourse on inequality, and I mean, I work more on wealth inequality than income inequality, is so much shaped by the American experience and the British experience, by the way, also. And that many countries that have either different developments or, and here I would say Germany, which is interesting for the fact that it has this high wealth inequality, but has a different institutional set to embed this kind of wealth inequality. So, for instance, having a developed welfare state makes a big difference for the need of wealth or assets for security and opportunity reasons. Yeah? And so that research would need to be actually much more detailed and country-specific in order to understand the differences and the nuances of this. And often in this global debate, let's say, yeah, this is lost because the global debate is very much a debate on specific Anglo-Saxon countries.
I agree. Yeah.
That's a very interesting point. I'm sure we all would have had another idea about it if you had asked us before your talk. Should we open up our conversation for the audience? I think it's a good moment to include you if you have questions. Here, Dr. Oetker. Please, a micro here, please. 1 second, the micro comes. Here, here.
I would like to ask a question. Is equality or non-equal development in states which are not democratic, let's call it autocratic, bigger or not? I would assume yes, but...
Well, I can try, and then Jens can help me. It depends. So there's a wide range of autocratic states, right? And they include, for example, well, yes, obviously Russia, China. But if you include a number of African countries with unpleasant dictators, then there's a lot of inequality in them. In Russia, inequality has been rising. It is, I can't remember right now, but I think it is not too far away from the US, actually, around 0.4 or so, the Gini. In China, inequality was growing considerably since the 1980s with the reforms, but then it stopped and started declining a little bit in the last few years, part because the Chinese leadership began to worry about it. Without having the graph here or the data exactly in my head, I would say that I don't know that there is an exact correlation that autocracy means more equality or less equality. I think you have autocratic countries with low inequality, like Cuba. Cuba has low inequality, it's an autocracy. Poland and Hungary, maybe they're not full autocracies, but they are, moving to this illiberal paradigm. They don't have very high inequality. On the other hand, Uganda and the Democratic Republic of Congo have much higher. So I don't know that there is an association. I'd be interested in whether Jens has data or other people have data that contradicts that. My point, though, is, remember, we care about a much richer set of things, right? We care about liberties and freedoms and respect for rights. That's enough reason to dislike the autocratic governments, kind of almost independently from what they do. I don't know that they promote equality or inequality. I think it's, in terms of income, it's possibly orthogonal, but I don't know what.
In terms, I also don't have the exact figures here, but in terms of wealth inequality, I would assume that there are correlations. So you find in these despotic regimes, you find this oligarchic class, and the inequality levels, and in terms of wealth, you find they are far beyond even the United States. China, I believe, is an interesting country because, as you said, it's a country where inequality rose. That is almost by definition, coming from a socialist past. But it is at the same time a country in which you have high growth levels.
Yes.
And so growth somehow made the kind of inequalities that developed at the same time acceptable. Yeah, for the question of social integration of China, I think these two developments need to be seen together. And this also makes understandable why the Chinese government is so concerned about the prospect of lower growth rates.
Yeah.
Here's another question, Nico Rabe. Can we have here a micro, please? Nico, can you stand up, please, that we...
Short question. Do you see empirical evidence for a correlation between inequality and political instability? Is there evidence from past revolutions, riots, instability of institutions? Thank you.
Thanks. You guys are asking difficult questions because they're all empirical questions, and I wish I had the data exactly at hand. I mean, there's certainly been an argument long made that more inequality leads to more instability. That's an argument that's been made. And I think that's true. I don't have the data on me, but I think it's true. I will tell you about some studies that I remember. Crime and violence, which are measured by a number of data sets, right, that measure deaths from conflict, homicides, all kinds of things. Crime and violence is positively correlated with inequality. That is in the data. Instability is an interesting one. I suspect for reasons that Jens was mentioning about this thing of one's prospects of growth and so on and so forth. And there are some theories actually about this as well. I suspect that what drives instability more than the levels of inequality may be changes in inequality, maybe big changes in distribution. And if you think of the Arab Spring, often kinds of inequalities that are not necessarily, again, the Gini coefficient. After the Arab Spring at the World Bank, we spent a lot of time looking at, was inequality in Egypt and Tunisia going up? It wasn't going up, and it wasn't high. But what was high was a different kind of inequality, which was the inequality in the treatment by the state. So if you were a crony of the families of those rulers, you had access to all of the licenses and all of the ability to operate. And if you were not, you couldn't start a business, you couldn't do anything. So different kinds of inequality in that sense. Remember the guy in Tunisia who set fire to himself and kind of started the Arab Spring was a person who was not able to keep his little street business, right? So that's one thing. And then, I see other hands, so I don't want to go on forever, but sometimes changes in inequality can be counterintuitive. So one of them is Chile. We'll come back to Chile later if you're interested, but there were these big protests in Chile. Inequality in Chile had been falling right up to the protests. So the idea that it was just rising inequality is not true. I have a theory, I have a blog about it. I don't want to talk about it now, but I think it's related to distribution, but it's not simple. Inequality is going up every time there is a conflict, right?
And you have actually a very famous predecessor who makes this argument that you refer to as Chile, and that's Albert Hirschman. Yeah. Yes. And Albert Hirschman, who of course worked, on Latin America, yes. He has this very interesting theory, also empirically validated, that it's not in situations of increasing inequality and increasing deprivation that uprising takes place, but no, it takes place in the moment when the situation actually gets better. And the explanation is that then people expect their own situation to get better very fast, and they get impatient with the slowness of the process.
The tunnel. Hirschman's tunnel.
Exactly.
But Hirschman and the tunnel are taking it all from de Tocqueville. So de Tocqueville, writing about the United States, has this point that actually it is when there is more equality that people expect that, and the inequality that is left becomes more objectionable in some sense. So I call the Chilean example part of the Tocqueville paradox. And the Tocqueville paradox is this idea that often revolutions and changes come when things are getting a little bit better.
Also verzögert, delayed. There was this blonde lady. Please give your name again, sorry.
Problem. Yvonne Bollo is my name. I would like to ask whether you see some evidence that special policies, social policies, education policies, like the minimum salary or decrease of tuition fees for university and so on, are there some policies where you would say, well, that has had a massive impact on inequality in one country where you really saw development right after or a couple of years after one policy was implemented? Thank you.
Well, that's an excellent question, and for once, I think I do know some answer, which I didn't for the other questions. I mean, I think there is a lot of evidence that educational reforms of various kinds impacts the distribution of income or opportunities. There is a very nice paper recently in the Review of Economics and Statistics about a reform in child care norms and access to early childhood education in Norway, which very clearly identifiably follow these groups later on, and finds that once the law was changed to make it easier for children to have access to these things, inequality of opportunity fell. In my own work in Brazil, we find that big increases, expansions in education through building of secondary schools reduced inequality in incomes later on. So educational reforms, and it's a big discussion in the US, of course, as well. The race between education and technology, right? Tinbergen's race. So education for sure plays a big role. So do cash transfer programs. Conditional cash transfers in much of Latin America have been associated with declines in inequality. In South Africa, there is a paper by Nobel Prize winner Esther Duflo and some co-authors about unconditional pensions given to grandmothers, improving the education and later the lives of the grandchildren. Well-targeted policies to underprivileged groups can work. You mentioned minimum wages. I think the evidence there is a little more mixed, but I think in my reading, again, I'd be interested in other people's readings, in my reading the evidence is that within reason, if you put the minimum wage at above the median, things are not going to work well. But within reasonable ranges, minimum wages have helped reduce wage inequality. This is certainly the evidence from the United States. Although in Brazil, I found that in one period it helped and in another it harmed. And the period where it harmed was a period of very low growth when the market just couldn't sustain the increases in inequality. So there was an increase in people below, in the informal sector, below the wages. So it's always complicated, but on the whole, I think reasonable minimum wages also do help. So do unions. Weakening of unions in the United States is very closely associated with a decline with an increase in inequality and a decline of wages at the bottom. So a healthy, you can go too far, but a healthy unionization system also helps. And there are many other things. I mean, in developing countries, there is evidence about how electrification in rural areas, here in Germany, we don't think about this, but there are people that don't have electricity for their children to read at night. Or electricity and piped water help women move from just carrying water from the well to doing other things. So there's a lot of evidence that those kinds of investment in infrastructure that serve the poorest people in the world do have an impact on their opportunities, often for women and children, right? So there are many policies like that can work.
You want to add something?
Nothing to add. Education really comes first. In the United States, the GI bills, Bildungsreform in Germany in the 1960s and 70s. I mean, this is probably the most important part. You cannot repeat this in every generation. Yeah, so you have this effect of upward social mobility in one generation, but then you cannot repeat it in the next education.
Why can't we repeat it?
Well, because at one point everybody has parents with a high school diploma or with a college degree, and then this upward social mobility is. I mean, you can achieve the same degree again, as the child, but not a higher.
This is now the problem what we are facing in the more Western world.
Certainly, in the sense that we experience less of upward social mobility and more downward social mobility compared to the post-war period. Not, of course, to all periods in modern history, but compared to the post-war period. Yeah. And one important aspect of this was educational reform and the financing of education. In the United States, very clearly after 1945, the GI Bill.
Interesting. Herr Geier, ich glaube, Sie hatten...
Yeah, thank you. Both of you presume that there's an infinite economic growth, and let me be the devil's advocate and say there is no such thing as an infinite economic growth. Johan Rockström with the planetary boundaries model, Kate Raworth with the donut model. There are various current examples suggesting that because of environmental issues and other related issues, there is no such thing as a growing pie, but we need to more look at kind of a redistribution of some kind and also take environmental factors into account. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, that's another excellent question. I'm sure Jens and Corinne will have views on it. So I know the donut economics, and I was actually Kate Raworth's discussant when she came to the World Bank to present it. Look, I think that the kind of growth we've been having clearly is unsustainable. But I don't think that spells necessarily the end of growth. And it doesn't, in part because a number of services, and a number of services based on internet technology, look, video games pollute very little, and they are a huge source of growth. We can have more opera. You can have more of a wide variety. You cannot have more petrol-based cars. You cannot have people flying around in airplanes like, well, I came by train, but we often fly around in airplanes if they are powered by these kinds of energy sources, though we cannot have more of those. You're absolutely right. Does that spell the end of growth? I don't think so, because the composition of the economy, well, first of all, the energy matrix is changing, and Germany is a leader on that, of course, although recently we've been talking a lot about dependence on gas. But Europe and Germany in particular have been leaders worldwide in renewable energy, and that's obviously something we can do. But in addition to the energy matrix, there is the composition of output itself, which I think will have to change, but it doesn't mean, in my view, doesn't need to spell the end of growth, so long as growth ends up happening more in services than in things. I don't know what you guys think about that.
I mean, yeah, let me briefly say something. So first of all, I don't presuppose that there is growth. I mean, my let's say wishful perspective would be yours. I'm just not as sure whether that is really possible in environmental terms, or whether that is actually an illusion. I don't have an answer for this. But if you look at growth rates in the developing world over the last decade, so you see a secular trend of reduced growth rates. And the issue that comes up with this, and that also refers to social movements or advocates for lower growth or no growth, which come from a sustainability argument, is you need to answer the question how you integrate a society where you have less to distribute. Our societies throughout the 20th century, where I'm talking about the Western societies, were largely socially integrated, meaning that conflicts were dispersed through the mechanism of growth. And you may very well be right that this cannot be the future. Either it cannot be it economically, or it cannot be it for environmental reasons. I'm not entirely sure about this, but that is a possibility. But what you have to think together with this is the whole question of social integration. And here I'm quite, I'm really puzzled, how this is going to work.
Can I add something really quickly to that? So the other point is, and I'm sorry if I sound too optimistic, because I'm not necessarily optimistic. I'm just saying it can be that way. Whether we will manage to make it that way, I don't know. But the other thing I want to mention very quickly is that carbon taxes, should we be able to implement them, should we choose to actually do them seriously, could be massively redistributive as well, because richer people in richer countries spend a lot more in carbon than poorer people. So, and you can generate a lot of revenue, which you could then spend in the policies that we've just discussed. So there would be an opportunity here for what people call a win-win, at least in the sense of environmental and equality policies, because you would be taxing in a way that would disincentivize the use of fossil fuels and at the same time be able to redistribute. So there's, I think, a great opportunity there that we are not focusing on, in part because it's not in the interest of very powerful groups.
That's a fantastic point. Please, here's a question.
Yeah, I have a question. Do you have a point of view on the inheritance tax in Western developed countries? Should the governments take them down to create more businesses, more wealth, and increase the cake? Or should they take them up in order to help equality?
So I do have a view on that, and it's that we should raise them. We should have very high inheritance taxes. And the reason for that is that, as I was saying, we already, through education, through work ethic, through a variety of channels, we already have this massive transmission of advantage from generation to generation. So I do think inheritance taxes would be a very natural consequence of the adoption of an equality of opportunity policy. I would not be in favor of 100% income taxes, because we would get this to that egalitarian position in the graph, which is very low for both. But inheritance taxes, I think I would support them very strongly. And would they create a disincentive? Maybe. But if you spend the money well, and you give it to young entrepreneurs who have good ideas but no access to credit, you may actually end up with the kind of redistribution that I would like to see, which is, one part of inequality of opportunity is that poor people have no access to credit markets. So if you were able to transfer some of the inheritance, I mean, it sounds easier than, the way I'm saying it sounds easy. I'm not saying it is easy to do it in practice. But I definitely think inheritance taxes could be used to redistribute wealth to other entrepreneurs and to other people who would create new businesses and who would create employment of their own. It's a myth that only the children of the rich can create employment for others, right? I think we could make that difference.
I don't know whether I should start with this, because then, we will end probably only an hour from now.
You must know this is a very special field of research of
I wrote
Beckert.
a whole book on
So I think it's a very complicated question. And so in short, and we have a second lecture on this question.
Right. No, I very much concur with Francisco. And let me say that, within liberal thought, and not Robert Nozick, at least not the early Robert Nozick, but John Stuart Mill was mentioned. You find in liberal thought very strong arguments against the dynastic bequeathing of wealth. And these are arguments at the end of equality of opportunity for the next generation. Now, I also think so I would never argue for confiscatory inheritance or estate tax. I think when one talks about it, one needs to take two things in addition into consideration. One is business firms and the continuation of, and that is of course in Germany an important issue of family managed firms, and so depriving them of capital through a tax. There needs to be, intensive thinking about what that means in terms of economic efficiency. There's one second thought that only became clear to me actually when working for a long time on this topic. I find it fascinating that although an inheritance tax would be, if you have I mean, let's take the current German system. Not more than roughly 5% of direct heirs pay this inheritance tax. So in a democratic system, you would actually expect that the majority would say, let's tax those fortunes, because that is a tax which will actually not affect ourselves. But if you have surveys on the question of inheritance taxation, then you have in Germany, but also in many other countries, majorities who are arguing against inheritance taxes. And I find this puzzling. And I think one part explanation in this, and that I say here also specifically in the German context, the American context is different in this, but in the German context is that there is a relevance of the family and family continuity. And so the tax is seen as a violation, as an undue violation of or interference with the family. And as a property, that is seen not just as the property of the individual, but as the property in a dynastic or in a long-term continuation. Now, this does not mean for me that inheritances should not be taxed, but in a discussion of inheritance taxes, I think these different elements need to be taken into account. But current inheritance taxes clearly, are far too low if we are serious about the idea of equal opportunity in terms of a somewhat more equal wealth distribution. And to me, inheritance taxes always seemed the better way of taxing wealth compared to property taxes or a wealth tax, because in a society that justifies social inequality on a meritocratic basis, it especially at the moment of the death of the individual, that a taxation is normatively less problematic compared to the situation that you have in a continuing wealth tax or high property taxes. That is a semi-short answer to a very complicated but very interesting topic.
Very interesting topic. You will also then have lots of people who give their wealth away, because then they can redistribute, to the aims they want to support, probably.
Absolutely, and I mean, if you that has, of course, again in the United States a much longer tradition, but Andrew Carnegie, who was the wealthiest person in the United States in the late 19th century, famously in this essay on a gospel of wealth, it is called. He says, "A person who dies thus rich dies in disgrace." Ja, so reich zu sterben ist moralisch anrüchig. Und die Forderung von Carnegie war, der also ein sehr, sagen wir mal, aggressiver Businessman war, die Forderung von Carnegie war genau, dass das Vermögen während der Lebenszeit philanthropisch an die Gemeinschaft zurückgegeben werden soll. Ja, und das hat natürlich eine ganz lange Tradition. Oh, sorry, I'm talking. I'm sorry. That's sometimes when I say something in German English, then I'm sorry. Perfect. Yeah. No. So, but most people probably understood me. So in the U.S., this idea of philanthropic redistribution of wealth has a very long tradition, and of course you find this. I mean, as I said, you get me now really going here. I mean, if you look at the level of philanthropy in the United States, then this is on a completely different level than here in Germany, and that has, of course, long-lasting historical backgrounds that still continue up to this day. Sorry for switching.
I know there are more questions. One very short one, because I think we need to come to an end, sadly, here. In the third row with the blue pullover. Sorry. Could you say your name, please?
Hi, good evening. My name is Georgia Bökel. I'm sort of stuck about how you differentiated in your lecture between the inequality that people were born into and the inequality that you can choose later on by effort and hard work. Because I thought this 3-year-old's brain was very, very, incredible, right? I'm a psychology scholar, and I really believe that you can't differentiate between the two. And, you know, Freud has taught us that you're not the master in your own house. And so I wonder how you think about this philosophical question, how you tackle that, what other, you know, scientific ideas you invite to this discussion.
Yeah, it's a huge question, that one.
But
And, you know, I had a
answer.
Huh?
A short,
Yeah.
a huge question,
Ooh,
but a short answer.
Can you hear? A short answer to that question is very difficult. But in the end, let me just say, in the end, and we can talk more after maybe, in the end, it's about how you define the types. And you end up leaving inequality within the types as the inequality that is acceptable. The moral choice is how you choose the types. And if you feel that quite a lot is circumstances, then you end up with narrower and narrower types and less acceptable inequality. I mean, in the limit, if you say the exact time and place you were born are circumstances, then all inequality is inequality of opportunity, and zero of it is acceptable, right? So there needs to be a societal choice about what counts as acceptable circumstances and what doesn't. And the sort of left-right spectrum on that would be, how narrowly do you define the types? It was as short as I could be.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Final of me, first, thank you both, but what worries you most at the moment in respect to inequality?
I think two things, if I can say two things. One is, I've been living in the rich world now for most of my life, and in the rich world, what worries me is exactly the sort of questions about the stagnation of a sort of lower middle. You know, when you study the history of the Second World War, at least when I studied it, we were told that some of the political basis of support for Hitler was the sort of working class, lower middle class. If you look at the United States now, if you look at a whole range of countries, the issues that both of you mentioned before, of people feeling stuck and feeling therefore that they no longer buy into society, that they no longer accept the social contract, they would like to get rid of it with something very dramatic. I think that is the first order of danger for the world today. The second thing, just quickly, is that whilst we're talking about this, in Africa, you have countries with 20, 30, 40% of the population living under $1.90 a day, $1.90 a day. And you think, how is that possible? And if you go there, you see these mud shacks with no electricity, no water, no nothing, where women have to go out and carry the wood and the water and so on. And we cannot forget about that. And that is, I think, the great shame of our age, that we have still 1 billion people or so, 700 million by our last count, living under those kinds of conditions. So those two things.
Was that Beckert?
I have, if you would have asked me first, I would have said exactly the first thing that Francisco said, and the second thing, of course, is much more in your mind from your work. But I think we have to understand, that's the first thing, that democracies have socioeconomic conditions, and if inequality gets out of hand, and especially if parts of the population, this middle class, lower middle class, is finding itself in a desperate situation, then the likelihood that this part of the population will develop resistances against the democratic system, and that we see in terms of populism, that we see in the Brexit, that we see in the Yellow Vest movement in France, then we see from this how social inequality is not just an issue relevant to economists, but it is an issue and to our economic well-being and the economic well-being of people, but it is something that concerns our polity as a whole.
Thank you. Thank you both for a very insightful evening. I think we learned a lot, everybody of us, me definitely. I invite you now all to continue our conversation and debates with a glass of wine. And I hope to see you also then soon again, because we have another lecture on the 10th of May in Munich, where we are continuing to talk about, especially about also what you said is one of your biggest worries. So thank you all for being here. Thank you both. Thank you and good night.